Hello, everyone. Today, I'm joined by Ian Samuels, the founding and managing partner of New System Ventures and also a Wharton undergrad and Penn alum. Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for joining the show. Where are you dialing in from today?
Thanks so much. I'm dialing in from my home in New York, but Wharton and Philly have a special place in my heart, so it's such a pleasure to be joining you today.
Great. Yeah, it definitely is a nice experience, a little bit of a break for us in business school, knowing that a lot of us will probably go back to New York after. So Philly is certainly great. And is New York where the New System Ventures team is based?
So the core team is all based here, but Nice. We're privileged to have a really incredible group of subject matter and technical experts that advise us around the world. And I'll give you a little preview, but we're going to be announcing a corporate advisory council made up of leading companies in key sectors like mobility, energy, and industry in the year ahead.
Very cool. Before we sort of dive into the very specifics of your individual investments, could you just walk us through at a very high level, what is New System Ventures? What sort of sectors do you guys invest in? What stage you invest in? And then we'll kind of get into a little bit of your background and why you decided to start it.
Absolutely. So New System Ventures is a investment firm that focuses on early stage investing, venture investing, taking a systems-led approach, first principles approach, to key sectors of the economy like mobility, energy, and industry, focused on themes like energy transition and security, reindustrialization, decarbonization. We're really excited to be sharing more about what we're working on and to get into it.
Yeah, definitely. Could you just walk us through your background? I mean, starting a fund is definitely no easy feat. So I'm kind of curious to understand, where did you get that experience from? What made you decide to take this leap into starting New System Ventures?
Absolutely. My background is at the intersection of investing, innovation, and policy. I started my career at Blackstone. I then went to the U.S. Treasury Department in 2009 to work on a combination of financial crisis response and economic recovery efforts, primarily focused on what we would now call clean tech. That included things like the tax credit programs for renewable energy, as well as the loan program office at the Department of Energy, which ran into a bunch of challenges that I worked on helping to address and has now really scaled, although its future in a future Trump administration is still somewhat uncertain. From there, I've been an investor, having helped start, prior to New System Ventures, 2 investment organizations, as well as had the opportunity to work at a scaled private equity and credit firm as well. And while doing so, was involved in incubating several companies as well. New System Ventures is a accumulation of all of those experiences collectively and has set the stage. All of that work, education at Penn to start with, but my career has set the stage for having a vision for how to build a repeatable, scalable research and investment process against the energy transition.
Wow. That's definitely a fascinating background and kind of, I guess, speaks to the whole systems and integrating multiple parts, given you sort of have this very experience and education that you bring to the table. You mentioned in the beginning the systems-based approach that New System Ventures takes and really following first principles. But for a lot of the crowd who maybe isn't super attuned to sort of like what a systems-based approach is, or even building an investment thesis, could you kind of just walk us through in a little more detail, like what does a systems-based approach mean? Are there individual sort of core themes that you guys have within sort of like the climate space? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you're diving right into this, because we founded NSV on the belief that a systems-led approach is needed to transform key sectors of the economy as rapidly and effectively as possible. Traditional approaches to this have generally proved insufficient to identify the core technologies required, commercialize, and then scale them. So we start by understanding, what is the status quo today? Where does the world look like today? And where do we think it is going or could go over the next 5, 10, 25 years? Our systems level research allows us to then really dive deep into the value chains associated with each of these transformations and identify within each new subsector that we go deep in what the parts of the value chain that are most valuable and venture scalable are. From there, we then have hypotheses about where we want to invest, and it gives us the ability to then go target and look for the most compelling companies, teams, technologies in those parts of the value chain that we're most excited about, And from there, determine, is our initial incoming hypothesis accurate, that this is really exciting? Is there a team, technology, et cetera, that we want to back and that we can find? And that's our preference. But occasionally, we will feel even more conviction in the opportunity, but less conviction that there's an existing company pursuing it. And in those select instances, we would help co-create or incubate new companies to go after that market opportunity. I've been involved in 3 such examples throughout my career, including in autonomous mobility, data center power, and tax credit and sustainable finance marketplaces. And it's our expectation that we will, in any given year, likely pursue 1 or 2 of those opportunities. I think it'd be helpful to bring that to life by giving you a few examples.
Sure.
For instance, within 24/7 carbon-free energy, which we define as pairing intermittent renewables with storage, baseload clean firm resources like geothermal, fusion, fission, hydro, as well as the third pillar of the stool, which is transmission and distribution. So better matching supply and demand on a temporal and geographic basis. We identified superconductors as a potentially transformative technology to accelerate all 3 of those pillars. They can be used in more advanced wind turbines and potentially in the future energy storage. They're a key component for magnetic confinement in fusion, and they are transformative for power distribution and transmission, basically allowing you to either build new power lines with much higher throughput or reconductor existing lines with substantially higher throughput for the same footprint. We view that as a picks and shovels play in the energy transition, and that led us to invest in Medox, which is a leading domestic superconductor manufacturer. On the back of that, we help the company, and this is the last part of our investment process, which is we partner with the teams to identify what are the most critical levers that we can use to help them scale. Sometimes it's securing more capital, and we helped co-lead a $40 million Series B extension that we announced earlier this quarter. Sometimes it's partnering with governments, and in this case, Medox has recently been awarded an $80 million grant by the Department of Energy to help scale their manufacturing footprint. And in other cases, it's team building or go-to-market and partnerships. All of these are examples of part of what we call our value creation plan. So that's our end-to-end process. But ultimately, by forcing ourselves to be system thinkers, it gives us the ability to achieve a few things. We're generally coming to founders prepared to share our own hypotheses while being open to being challenged and debate our worldview. It allows us to try to be ahead of, as opposed to get caught up in trends and hype, and focus on what the fundamental value and transformative potential of these opportunities are. Ultimately, we think about the world sometimes as a Gartner hype cycle that we're all on, where sometimes people get overly excited or overly down on particular sectors. We're trying to be more stable in our perspective and look and say, what is the ultimate long-term potential of this? And then how do we mobilize capital, people, commercial opportunities against it? And that gives us the ability to go out and talk to everyone else in the ecosystem, big companies, the technical academics, entrepreneurs, and come with a prepared mind and prepared perspective on where we think the best opportunities are.
If I could sum it up, it's almost a mechanism to effectively ground you as an investment team into like, what are the areas that we care about, where we actually want to focus. But B, it sounds like you're also using it as a way to really understand the individual sector or industry to figure out where, for my limited amount of dollars, can I have the greatest climate impact in some sense? Where is the area for most ripe for disruption? Is that kind of how you're thinking about it in some sense, of like trying to really understand the areas where you can have the most leverage?
Yes. And I would build on that, not just if we have scarce capital, but also if we have scarce time. In any given quarter, in a given year, we see hundreds of companies that come and meet with us, that we find through our work, are introduced to us. We only have the ability in any given year to make a limited number of investments and to focus on a limited number of areas. This allows us to best prioritize our time, as well as be most respectful of our counterparties, which is We're trying to go in and say, we think these are the places that have the biggest leverage points. That's why we're excited to come and have this conversation with you. And that's why we're excited to prospectively invest in your company, partner with you for many years and help you grow and scale.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I now kind of you already mentioned one of the companies I wanted to ask you around of Medox. And earlier you talked about venture scalable, and you have companies in your portfolio that are fundamentally building like a physical product, or like at least something that plugs into the physical world, which is often not what I think venture scalable, I think B2B SaaS. And I think that's what a lot of people typically think about in terms of venture scalable. But I know in the climate world, we kind of need to shift that paradigm. So I'm curious to understand from you, do you still see these companies being able to scale and revenue and earnings and then ultimately reach an exit in sort of the same time scale of a software company? And maybe like what are the different challenges in terms of building a hardware company like Medox versus just a simple software solution, or not simple software, but just a traditional software solution?
Yeah. This is one of the big debates within the venture capital industry today around deep tech and energy transition and so forth. Ultimately, we are facing an unprecedented commercial and macro tailwinds to accelerate the adoption of many of these solutions. But there's also been a lot of pain and suffering. One of the places that we start is going back to Clean Tech 1.0, where we could debate if I was in the cheap seats or not, but I was sitting in a government seat and watched a number of these companies struggle. Many of them fail. Some of them grind out to ultimate long-term success. And many of those were hardware companies. Well, at the same time, you saw a decade plus of SaaS companies become immensely successful, often fairly rapidly. So there are a bunch of different things that we take away from that. Some people do think that the only way to make money in climate tech or energy transition is by investing in low capital intensity software businesses. We think that's actually the wrong lesson. Some of the most valuable companies in the world have substantial hardware components. You look at Apple or SpaceX, Tesla, as three prototypical examples of this. But many of these companies that are trying to get there don't have great plans around how to be capital efficient while being capital intense. And from us, that's one of the most important lessons learned. So for us, we try to target a balanced portfolio. Over time, it's our expectation that we're going to invest roughly at half in software and services businesses, and then the other half in hardware or capital intense companies. There's certain characteristics that we look for in those companies. I mentioned being capital efficient even when capital intense, and being really thoughtful about the product roadmap, the commercialization strategy, the corporate partnership strategy, how you sell your product. Are you selling hardware plus services? Are you trying to sell as a service? And if so, how are you going to finance the capital intensity? And how do you prepare your business to raise less dilutive forms of capital? Be that project finance, be that in some cases partnering with US federal, state government, or governments throughout the world to be able to access lower cost of capital. We try to help our ecosystem in having conversations like this, but really in depth our portfolio companies in doing that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting answer. And it also speaks to, I guess, like the evolution in thinking. But it also raises like another question to me, because you sort of alluded to the need for a different capital stack for some of these businesses, like taking on less dilutive capital. And you mentioned that one of your core value propositions is helping people find that next investment to help them supercharge the company to the next stage of growth. But it feels that sometimes, for example, in like the geothermal space, that these are first of a kind technologies that are quite hard maybe to sort of find that more project financing type capital. So do you think in your time of being in the energy and climate world, going all the way back to the 2000s to now, do you think that capital stack has really shifted? Because it feels that some people are still saying we're looking for that capital to scale our business in a project finance way, but it doesn't necessarily exist out there.
Absolutely. This is a great question. There's a lot of discussion, debate about first of a kind projects. First and foremost, is it abbreviated FOAC or FOAK?
Yeah.
I leave that to others more educated in the English language than myself. But regardless, the more interesting and important set of questions arise around, from my perspective, how do you accomplish as much as possible and prove and de-risk as much as possible with the lowest amount of resources, such that you can get to the point that more conventional large pools of capital are able to perceive you as having low technological and operational risk.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can get very creative in doing that. Sometimes you have to grind it out and equity fund initial components of your business plan while doing so. How each situation's a little bit different. Like we saw even the other day, Fervo just announced, who's one of the leaders in enhanced geothermal, an incremental both equity fundraise and debt fundraise. I think they've been very thoughtful about this. They partnered very early on with Google to build a smaller demonstration facility that proved a lot of the hypotheses that allowed them to then raise more capital. How and if companies like that are then able to raise large-scale project finance remains an open question. And what additional parts of the capital stack in between here and there are required to scale is going to be both case by case, but also may require new capital tools. It also requires, I think, more increasing levels of ingenuity by early stage founders to set themselves up for success. Generally, and earlier in my career, I was involved in an effort to provide growth in venture equity plus project finance simultaneously. One of the things I found in that process was that most companies find it very hard to take those two capital tools coterminously with one another, in part because they haven't been well prepared by their existing venture investors, by their own efforts to be able to take in project finance, to have financeable offtake agreements, and all of the technology de-risking required. This is going to require not just new forms of capital, but additional learnings, training, human capital talent embedded in those companies fairly early on in order to be successful.
This is a super interesting topic. I could talk about the capital stack all day long. I do want to pivot back towards talking a little bit about sort of some of your portfolio companies. In this case, Medox. What I always think of a big challenge in sort of the scaling of these companies is just like the distribution challenge. I mean, you're ultimately, in the case of Medox, selling to utilities or people who build and manage and operate grids, right? And I think about that. That's a long-term planning cycle in terms of just planning what I'm going to do and how I'm going to allocate my capital to sort of update my grid, to then actually go out and build, choose vendors, and so on and so forth. What are some of the techniques that maybe you're helping your portfolio companies on in terms of shortening maybe that distribution time frame to be able to start actually getting revenue on the books, not 5 years, but in a year to two or something like that?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. We can use some other examples as well.
Yeah, feel free.
If we want to just double down on Medox for a moment, even a year ago when we first made the decision to invest, there were real questions around how big the markets were beyond fusion. Fusion magnetic confinement, there's no other good solution at the moment other than high-temperature superconductors. And the global supply of high-temperature superconductors, while it's growing rapidly, is, if you look at some of the announcements recently for large facilities, for either test facilities or commercial facilities, those facilities require, in many cases, multiple years of existing supply, let alone transmission cables or any of these other options. In the last year, what we've seen, though, well beyond fusion magnetic confinement, is a burning platform need to generate more power and then move it to places where you're seeing substantial load growth. Data centers perhaps being the best example of that. Data centers face real challenges with pulling high power lines, transmission lines, through constrained rights of way in places where data centers have traditionally been built, perhaps Northern Virginia being the penultimate example, but there is plenty of others. And then distributing, once the power gets to the front door of a data center, even distributing it internally, we're seeing data center racks designs go from, let's say, 10 kW to, for next generation GPU racks, hundreds of kW, to 300, potentially even 500 kW, which is mind-blowing if you think about it. And then you actually get into very discrete problems of how do you get the power from what is the size of the copper cabling required, what is the size of the bus bars required to get the power from the front door to that rack, and it actually becomes somewhere between a difficult and impossible design and logistics problem. There's now increasing numbers of industries that are recognizing the potential and importance of superconductivity for generation and transmission distribution use cases. And it's our job to figure out both how do we meet that demand, as well as how do we help stimulate it and find those demand centers and the partners that are going to be the best early partners to test and develop and prove out new technologies in variety of operational use cases that will then unlock, for instance, more traditional utilities being willing to deploy this at scale. That requires a creative group of counterparties, but we're increasingly seeing that when it goes from intellectual interest, like it was with some tests a decade ago in government, to we have a burning commercial need for this, that for things that are not just more climate friendly, but also more efficient and scalable and meet business problems, that's where the rubber really hits the road.
Yeah. It almost sounds like it's like a stepping stone approach. Just like instead of trying to bite off utilities, which is a big market and challenging one to break into, starting with like smaller use cases and building the confidence in the market understanding from that point on.
Totally. And there are cases where partnering with utilities at the get-go could make sense. One of in the HVAC space, so building operations space, it makes a lot of sense to move from either delivered fuels or boilers or even resistance heating to heat pumps. But how do you do that and partner with folks in a way that makes sense at reasonable CAC and efficient delivery? We'll have more to share soon, but we think that there's some really interesting opportunities to help solve key challenges that utilities have, which is how do you electrify and how do you do so in an efficient and thoughtful way and with the trust that your customers put in you, that policymakers put in you, and so forth. And we've seen some really interesting business models evolving in this space as well. Maybe that's a good transition to go from hardware, although I'm happy to share a few more examples of hardware.
Yeah, I was actually about to transition myself. So I think to your point, it's a good segue to sort of move over into talking about the software space and a couple of your investments there. I think it would be first, I think people kind of get an innate understanding of what the role of a hardware startup is, like superconductivity and the role of decarbonizing our planet. I think it's oftentimes a little bit more sort of second, third order, the role of software in decarbonizing our planet, because, a lot of people just interact with it in your computer or just in a lot of variety of different ways that don't necessarily seem very closely tied to the climate. I picked out Crux or Eli, but feel free to choose any one of your portfolio companies that you want. I think it would be helpful to just start with, okay, here's what a climate software company sort of looks like.
Absolutely. First, and I think that there's some companies that are doing great work here, but there are a lot of carbon accounting software platforms. We may, in the future, support ones that have transformative solutions, but we think that software and services need to be applied much more broadly to help solve a bunch of climate and energy transition security related challenges. So one example is Crux. For those of you that aren't familiar, Crux is one of the leading, if not the leading marketplace for sustainable finance. And they started with a really important and exciting wedge, which is transferable tax credits that were made possible under the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, mainly has carrots in it as opposed to sticks. That was an intentional design choice by the drafters of the bill, both to get it passed, as well as to make it a really successful part of the ecosystem, in that it contains a bunch of provisions that are really supportive of broader policy goals, which include energy security and reindustrialization of the United States. So a substantial part of the tax credits are intended to help make things here in America. In part for that reason, somewhere between, depending on the provision, 2/3 and 80% of the benefits are going to Republican states and congressional districts, as you might otherwise define them. What's really interesting, so when the bill passed, Alfred Johnson, who is the CEO and co-founder of Crux, was working really closely with us as a founding advisor to New System Ventures, was reading through the bill, and it increasingly became clear to him that the tax equity markets, which have traditionally been dominated by a handful of large banks like JP Morgan and B of A, was going to be transformed in a very expansive way and was going to provide the ability to go direct between developers, a range of developers, and a range of folks who have both folks themselves, big companies who have tax liabilities, as well as a range of intermediaries that either existed or could arise from that. That core of that idea that Alfred had led to building a company around it. Alfred and I worked together very early on at Treasury. The last time the tax credits for renewable energy were substantially changed, it became a natural way of collaborating together. And ultimately, Alfred and his co-founder, Alan, who worked together on their last marketplace startup, were able to create a software package and marketplace that makes it much more efficient if you're a renewables developer, a sustainable finance developer, advanced manufacturer of a range of components here in the United States, for you to go and monetize these tax credits more efficiently at higher value and with less brain damage and legal fees and so forth. We were involved in helping with the co-creation of the platform. We were an early investor, and I continue to be a close partner of the company to this day. And it's been really exciting to see it go from the inception of an idea to a scaled platform with, I believe at this point, over $20 billion of credits on platform, ranging from very small developers that otherwise wouldn't have been able to access tax equity at all, through some of the largest sustainable finance developers and advanced manufacturers in the country.
Yeah. I mean, how has it been? Marketplace businesses are traditionally kind of like a tricky one to grow because you need the two sides in terms of your growth. And so given your role as like an early sort of founder and not founder, but an advisor in the company, how is that disruption in terms of taking away business ultimately from these very sort of like embedded institutions of the JP Morgans, the Bank of Americas, to a marketplace like Crux? How was that challenge in the beginning, and how did you guys maybe like overcome it perhaps?
It's a great question. As you noted, cold starting marketplaces is often very difficult. What became clear from some of the early product market fit calls that we did was just how in demand these solutions were from developers and manufacturers who had tax credits that they wanted to monetize. And then on the other side, the pitch to companies is, hey, you could reduce your tax bill each quarter, each year, and help achieve other objectives you may have, which is sourcing clean power or contributing to the sustainable development of your supplier base. If you're looking to source motors or batteries or any number of other critical components, it increasingly becomes a no-brainer for both sides. And if you can build critical mass and become perceived through thought leadership and excellent execution, like what the Crux team has done, it becomes a self-fulfilling flywheel, if you will.
Sure. No, I mean, that's super fascinating. And I know the Crux story well myself, and it's been so cool to see how it's grown so quickly, just like based on this need. However, and I think this is often the case in a lot of the climate spaces, is that they're often inspired a bit by regulation in some cases, and at least the business models. And in the beginning of the call, you mentioned we have a new administration now, which may come in. And I think a lot of people are debating whether the IRA will ultimately change, given to your point, where the money is ultimately flowing is often in Republican leaning districts. How do you view that navigating the policy world and the implications that then has on the business when you're making your investments, right? Is it that you think that you see the IRA, you think it's going to stick around, or if anything were to change on the tax side there, Crux would be able to sort of pivot and find a new core business? It just seems like kind of like a risk that is somewhat hard to avoid.
Yeah, maybe just to finish the story on Crux, which is by virtue of their position in a key part of the market, they're increasingly able to provide other solutions to many of these same counterparties and become the leading marketplace for sustainable finance more broadly. I'm very optimistic about Crux's team, as you noted, including Jim Alderson-Smith, who's a recent Wharton alumnus and worked very closely with us, as well as the core team there, and their ability to continue to build on the great foundation that they have, regardless of the political environment that we find ourselves in. More generally, I would say we're taking a very macro approach to how we think about the policy environment. So number one, if we're investing not over a 2 or 4 year cycle, but over a 5 to 10 year cycle, particularly with venture, it gives us the ability to look out and think over longer periods of time, where do we see the most opportunity? our goal is to invest against long-term themes really successfully, but while also taking into account both US policy and global policy. So I talked about some of these core themes of not just energy transition, but energy security and reindustrialization. Those have informed a little bit of what we're thinking about, which is there are places where there are even more macro tailwinds. Those include domestic advanced manufacturing. Medox is a great example of that. Automation, particularly in places where they're dirty, dangerous jobs, and the labor supply for them may come under stress here in America. An example of that is a company that is in our portfolio called Renovate Robotics, which is building robotic solution for roofing, which is the third most dangerous job in the country. So to the extent that you can help spur additional efficiencies here, allow people to have new roofs on their homes, which generally improve the building envelope efficiency by often 30% or more, reduce the soft costs of rooftop solar, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, and are able to be responsive to increasingly poor weather conditions. There's an article the other day that hail costs for insurers are going through the roof, literally and figuratively. Hurricanes are happening with increasing frequency and people's roofs are getting ripped off. Being able to respond not just with putting people on buses and shipping them down to wherever the latest disaster zone is, but being able to have robotic solutions that can help provide leverage to those folks and surge capacity is increasingly interesting and important. On the other hand, you have places like really hard to abate sectors with high capital costs and ongoing green premiums. Those are areas that give us some pause over the next few years, particularly if they're really trying to go into scale-up mode over this period of time, unless folks can find compelling solutions to that. In each case, ultimately, we believe that solutions that are not just greener and cleaner, but also more efficient and better are going to be no-brainers and winners over the long term.
Sure. The classic, it needs to also be better, safer, faster, cheaper, and cleaner.
Exactly.
That's really interesting to sort of like hear your take on it. And I guess the robustness that a lot of these companies are building to potentially survive any sort of change in regulation, but just the fact that the regulation probably also won't change, maybe perhaps encouraging to hear. As we kind of close out this section on software, is there any sort of sector that you're particularly keen on going forward that you're saying that in you and your team that like, we got to find a company here to invest or how we're going to start one ourselves?
So that's an excellent question. As we're recording this, we are also in the process of aligning on our year-end wrap-up. So looking back, what thematic research areas, systems level research areas have we completed that we're really excited about and we want to make investments? What areas do we need to continue to wrap up? And then where do we want to prioritize our work in the year ahead? We're going to be sharing a lot more on this in the coming months, so stay tuned. But I'll give you and your listeners a little bit of a sneak peek, which is areas that we're wrapping up now include long-duration energy storage. So we made an investment in a thermal battery company. We think that there are a range of other areas that are really exciting. We continue to look, I'd say, critically at areas of battery technology that we think not just hardware point source interventions, but platforms to help better manage batteries, both within vehicles and for the grid, amongst other applications, are really exciting and interesting. And then we're continuing to look really thoughtfully at ways of helping to enable insurance and project financing as well. In the year ahead, I suspect we're going to be spending a lot of time both on how do we accelerate load growth in a thoughtful and sustainable manner from base load generation in addition to energy storage, as well as supporting the grid's scale up and pace. In mobility, in places where we're seeing more advanced mode shift and financing, one place where we think we're going to see likely a withdrawal of financing for transit. I mean, your experience in VIA, I'm sure you have strong perspectives on this as well. But we think that we're going to see even more of a move towards user pay as budgets potentially become constrained and federal government support is less available. And then on the industry side, we're seeing unprecedented levels of load growth, including from data centers, from cold chain, and from electrification across the board. Some of these solutions can be software oriented to help enable distributed energy resources, planning, more efficient operations of these facilities. Some of them are going to be hardware interventions for better managing specific components of this. We think that there's going to become an increasing focus on supply chains for critical components and critical minerals required for energy security and the energy transition. These are all areas that we're really going to be looking at closely and talking more about in the year ahead. And we're open both to software solutions and marketplaces, services, businesses that are tech-enabled that better help the people that are doing this today to do it even better, cleaner, faster. And we're looking at transformative solutions, often which will have a hardware or capital intensity component to them that can completely change the paradigm or disrupt the status quo.
Sure. Well, I think that was an incredible note to end on. I think just to sort of hear what your thoughts are going into 2025, it sounds like a super exciting list, and I'm excited to follow on and see where you guys ultimately end up investing or spending more of your time in as you dive further into those industries. So thank you so much again for the time, Ian. I really enjoyed doing this episode. I thought we got a huge range of topics and thoughts into this. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers.